My name is Dr. Ayodele Nzinga, and I'm coming to you from Ohlone Land, the town, Oakland, California.
How can developers and city planners find a balance between economic development and cultural preservation?
So, how can developers and city planners plan better? The word planning has a meaning. I often think that either planners universally, locally, regionally, and federally are all either incredibly bad at their jobs or perhaps the future they are planning for doesn't include the communities that I'm a part of and that I represent. I think the way that they can plan more effectively is to be intentional. They decide to either starve or feed something. So what are developers starving or feeding? And if you build a building that's intended to last for 100 years, what community do you envision your building being in after you are no longer there? I would suggest that to build in thriving for everyone gives them the best possibility of being able to imagine that asset being in a really good place 100 years from now. So what I do when I'm talking to developers is I invite them to participate in what I call intentional development century work. I point out they have the opportunity and the resource to build the world we all say out loud that we want to live in, and to build and have that world. It has to be accessible to all, and there is a way to do that.
What role can art play in the city development process?
Art can, when done properly and with community engagement and involvement, it can reflect the communities that have historically existed in neighborhoods within the city, and it can help enshrine the history and the cultural institutions, and it could also reflect the aesthetic and the vibrancy of a community. We believe in painting like a better world into existence. We don't like to reflect the negativity, the violence, etc., as much as we want to tell the story of resilience and growth and cultural practice and dreams for the future. So painting a new reality into existence is also a part of that process. But we want that new reality can either be inclusive of existing communities and reflective of the cultural practices and institutions and heritage of a city, or it can be amnesia of an erasing of those same communities. So it's a double-edged sword, and we're fighting for art to tell the story of those communities.
Should municipal governments compromise development opportunities in order to preserve cultural activities that resulted from historical policies that were unjust, such as the bank loan policies purposely placed people of color into certain communities?
So the short answer to this is yes. Cultural preservation should be prioritized. To give you a little background here, predatory bank loans, such as those which fueled the U.S. recession in 2008, are just one form of discrimination. Redlining began as a federal policy in the Great Depression of the 1930s, and it was actually instituted by the Federal Housing Authority. And then in the 1950s and 60s, you had urban renewal, which was another form of discrimination that disproportionately impacted communities of color. As a result, communities of color have had to develop cultural activities as a form of resilience and survival. And the reason that these cultures and diverse forms of culture should be supported is because it makes all of us a better society. I mean, if you think about it, what's better? A vibrant, dynamic culture with lots of different aspects and concepts to it, or a monolithic culture? I mean, imagine if you only had one restaurant and that was a McDonald's. I mean, that would be pretty boring, right? But there's also a very strong argument to support why cultural equity really should be prioritized by city governments. And that's because in the United States, discrimination is illegal. You actually have an amendment to the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, that was ratified back in 1868 and further reinforced by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And because of this, discrimination on the basis of race or gender or ethnicity or sexual preference, they're all illegal. And because of that, the government, whether it's city government, the state government, or a federal government, they all have a mandate not to allow discrimination. But what happens with development is that it is often not an overt and direct form of discrimination. The impacts end up being disproportionate and reinforcing inequity, which is already systemic. So that is why you actually need to counter that and mitigate the impacts of development. A lot of times, community pressure can result in community benefit agreements with developers that do mitigate some of these forms of or some of these impacts of development, such as displacement and what we would call gentrification. But it's a lot of work to do that, and it would be much better if cities already understood that development is going to have negative impacts, particularly on vulnerable communities. And there really should be policies that enforce and implement cultural equity across the board to ensure that these vulnerable communities aren't put further at risk by development and by gentrification. And prioritizing cultural activities is one of the ways to do that, and to get it done in a way that is equitable and cultivates sustainability for communities of color across the board. That's really the way it should be, and there really is a very strong legal and ethical and moral argument as to why that should be the case. Hope that answers the question. Peace.
Do you think the compromise from the community is a continuation of the injustices people of color have historically faced? When and how do you see this injustice ending?
Hi, my name is Lailani Hewen. I am a member of the Oakland Chinatown Coalition, and my family has been in Oakland Chinatown since 1906. So the community benefits agreement that we won, we didn't get everything that we wanted, and it was our first one, so we didn't know to ask for a lot. We lost the mural, but we did get some wins to replace the mural, to get some contributions to the Malanga Center for their affordable housing, as well as for some of the programming and arts that would allow the local artists to be part of the project and benefit from it. And I think the most important thing is that it created a shift in Oakland City Hall and in the planning department and in the community about the expectations for developers coming into Oakland, trying to be a part of our community and profiting off of us. The expectation shifted that developers coming in should contribute to the community. And before, that had never been the case. Really, the city had just welcomed developers in without asking anything, because they were desperate to have development. But we knew we were in a different place in our history in Oakland, that rents were skyrocketing. There was a lot of profit to be had, and a lot of pain, potential harm that could be caused to the community. So the community benefits agreements were necessary. And so it kind of shifted in the city, this expectation for community benefits agreements around that time, so that developers coming in afterwards would kind of assume that they had to then contribute to affordable housing, that they had to help the community stabilize in the midst of this drastic change during gentrification and development. So it was a critical step. And I think the most important thing about both what that process changed and about how we end the kind of historic injustices against communities of color in terms of development and the battle over land and power is that communities of color have to be at the table in these kinds of decisions. So that looks a lot of different ways. It looks like people of color being in positions of power as elected officials, as the mayor, as the city council members who have a huge impact on development. But it also means making sure our communities are really represented on planning commissions and zoning commissions. It also means that community organizations are at the table in neighborhoods that they work in. And so cities like Philadelphia have a structure that allows for neighborhood input in large developments that happen in each neighborhood. So it's called the Registered Community Organization structure. And so these are the kinds of structures that will allow communities to permanently be at the table when big developments happen in their community. The main thing that I learned from traveling nationally and looking at best practices on how to really address gentrification, how to stop displacement, was that the key element of equity is that communities are at the table, that there are structures for them to be at the table and negotiate, and that their voice actually matters, right? So if we want this injustice to end, we need to have those kinds of structures and policies that allow communities of color, low-income communities to have a say. That it's not just up to the developers, it's not just up to the elected officials, but there are truly democratic participatory processes in place in planning departments. And there's only a handful of planning departments around the country that really have progressive structures in place like this. So Oakland doesn't, and that's what we're fighting for, and that's what I think this community organizing helped to shift. Is that shift towards understanding that communities are a key part of development, that they should be if we want to rectify past historic injustices and also create better, thriving communities for our cities.
How can members of communities have a say in how their community develops?
Hi, my name is Spencer Wilkinson. I'm the director of Alice Street. And to answer the question about how community members can get involved and have a say in how their communities are developed, I think the example of the story that was told is a great example of how people can join together across diverse coalitions in their communities and find like-minded people to increase and amplify the strength of the voice of the community. And it was so inspiring to witness members of the Chinatown Coalition in Oakland and the Black Arts Movement Business District in Oakland combining their efforts and sitting down at the table with developers and with city officials to negotiate for community benefit agreements. I think that's a really powerful example, and kind of lends itself to the power of community and the power of voices, and really looking at people who you might not necessarily be in community with, but might share the same issues, and finding a commonality and common voice. And again, thank you to Marta Loop for involving Alice Street in your festival this year. It's a real honor. Thank you.
Do people even realize the possible choices for a community to look and feel?
I think people are just realizing the possibilities of what can be done in our communities with public art, especially murals. In fact, around the globe in different countries and cities, there has been a renaissance of public art and muralism, leaving entire neighborhoods as art galleries and outdoor museums. People are also realizing the power of the content of the images represented, many times telling the story and struggle of our communities, honoring our elders and youth, and recreating magical and spiritual matters. I think that active community members with resources and support from their government can shape the physical space, allowing room for artists to tell our stories, their stories, where the whole community benefit from it. The people need to be active actors on shaping their neighborhoods and visualizing the future of how it will look and feel in our communities in the future. It's work in progress.
Do money and growth always win?
I would pull the question back and ask you to think about the word growth and how you would like to interpret it. Normally, we think about growth as being bigger, taller, more mass, more space. What if we measured it in impact? Then how would that look? If we measured it in outcome, then how would that look? If we measured it along the guidelines of the social determinants of health over a period of time, then what kind of growth would it look like? Is it impossible for things to get deeper and still growing, or wider so they can hold more people and still be growing? Inclusivity is extremely important in a capitalistic frame. Capitalism is inherently cannibalistic. It eats its young. So we need to imagine other frames that are more amenable for human progress overall, for all of us. Because it's literally all of us and none of us, even if we don't choose to look at it that way. Coming to you from the town on a lonely land. This is Dr. Ayodele Nzenga. Thanks for having us.
I hope you enjoyed today's screening. I would like to take this time to thank you again for supporting the Marta Loop Justice Film Festival during this very special year. Our festival could not have survived without your continuous support. Please subscribe to our mailing list through our official website or follow us on social media, including Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, to receive the latest updates. As we move forward toward 2021, a lot remains uncertain. However, we will do our best to keep you informed about our festival. Thank you again for joining us tonight. I wish you and your loved ones all the best in the month to come, and a good night.